2 days ago, the United States Air Force carried out the largest stealth bomber airstrike in history, with 7 B-2 Spirits dropping 14 of the largest bunker-busting bombs ever built on 2 of Iran's most heavily protected nuclear facilities. Now, despite contradicting claims made all across social media, it's still too early to know for sure just how effective these strikes were in crippling Iran's long-term ambitions to develop and field nuclear weapons. But even with some uncertainty looming, there's really no denying that this mission was an immense operational success, and even a downright scary reminder of just how capable American air power really can be when let off its leash. This offensive involved the coordination of more than 125 aircraft, ranging from decoy bombers sent out over the Pacific, tankers refilling aircraft in near radio silence, spy planes, electronic warfare assets, 2 generations of fighter aircraft, and a whole lot more, all bolstered by a precisely coordinated Tomahawk missile strike launched from America's uniquely capable Ohio-class guided missile submarines hundreds of miles away. And while the decision to conduct this strike was a politically controversial one, the mission, dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer, is sure to be studied by military scholars and pilots in training for years to come. So let's talk about why. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. A recent Wall Street Journal report alleges that much of America's interest in UFOs, or UAPs as they're now known, was born out of a deliberate disinformation campaign conducted by the US military. And I've been staying on top of this story with Ground News. Ground News is an aggregator that collects articles published by news outlets all around the world and places them all into a single easy-to-read feed that helps me not just stay on top of what's going on, but to see right through many of the most common forms of media bias. Right here on Ground News, I can see that 74 news outlets have already covered this story, but there's been much more interest from right-leaning ones, with 21 right-leaning outlets covering it so far, and only 7 left-leaning outlets. Now, left-leaning outlets focused primarily on the deception in their headlines, with takes like Air Force Colonel gave out photos of flying saucers near Area 51. Whereas right-leaning outlets seem to focus on the broader picture, with headlines like, "To conceal secret projects, US military has misled officers on UFOs." And Ground News also shows you vital information about each of these outlets along with those headlines, like their political bias, factuality rating, corporate ownership, or government affiliations. And I love the Ground News For You tab that compiles stories that are sure to interest me because they're based on topics I've chosen to stay on top of. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or just follow that link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that will help you stay on top of things. At 1 minute after midnight on Saturday morning, the first in a large formation of B-2 Spirit stealth bombers took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. With seemingly 9 bombers involved, this single formation represented some $20 billion worth of aircraft, though the formation itself would split immediately after takeoff, with 2 B-2s reportedly heading west out over the Pacific with their transponders active, making it possible for the world to track what appeared to be the repositioning of these bombers out to Guam in advance of future strikes, or maybe as a bit of geopolitical theater to apply additional pressure to the Iranian regime. But the other 7 stealth bombers, flying with their transponders off and with minimal communications between them, headed east instead. Now, the B-2 Spirit is widely recognized for its extreme low observability, which would certainly be a very important factor in this mission. But there was another reason why these exotic flying wings were chosen for this specific job. But before I dive into that, I want to give you my standard disclaimer for these types of news stories. I know that the decision to strike Iran was a politically controversial one, but we're not going to discuss the politics here or make any kinds of moral or ethical judgments. Instead, our focus is going to be placed squarely on the military operation, how it was conducted, and what it might mean moving forward. So, the B-2 is the only aircraft on the planet that's capable of deploying the largest bunker buster known to mankind. A massive 30,000-pound class weapon encased in a solid ferro-cobalt alloy that's more than 3 inches thick in places, with a solid tungsten nose designed to rip through hundreds of feet of steel-reinforced concrete before detonating more than 5,300 pounds of explosives housed inside. And this explosive payload was designed specifically for bunker-busting applications. Upon detonation, each of these bombs releases roughly the same explosive power as some 265 Hellfire missiles combined. Now, this weapon's official designation, you may already know, is the GBU-57 MOP, short for Massive Ordnance Penetrator. And until this week, it had never been used in combat, at least as far as we know. Now, the US Air Force, notorious for underreporting the maximum capabilities of its aircraft, and its weapons for that matter, says the B-2 Spirit is capable of carrying a very respectable 40,000-pound payload. But as these 7 bombers crept across the Atlantic sky under cover of both darkness and near radio silence, they each carried 2 of the world's biggest bunker busters, or just shy of 60,000 pounds of steel-reinforced explosive power, which really just goes to show that you shouldn't believe everything you read on the internet. Now, technically speaking, the B-2 has enough range to fly all the way to Iran from Missouri without needing to refuel, but in reality, with these massive payloads on board, these aircraft needed to be refueled multiple times, which meant all 7 bombers linking up with KC-135 or KC-46 tanker aircraft along pre-planned points throughout this globe-spanning route. With secrecy at a premium, communications between the bombers and the tankers were even kept at a minimum. And after about 17 hours in the air, this covert multi-billion-dollar bomber formation crossed into the domain of US CENTCOM, or the United States Central Command. Now, CENTCOM is one of 11 combatant commands the United States maintains all around the world, and CENTCOM is specifically tasked with overseeing more than 4 million square miles of territory, encompassing some 21 nations and parts of 3 continents. But throughout much of the past few decades, CENTCOM is often primarily known as the command element overseeing American and often allied operations throughout the Middle East. And this weekend was no different. Shortly after crossing the threshold into CENTCOM's area of responsibility, those 7 B-2 bombers were joined by 4th and 5th generation fighter escorts flying out further ahead. Now, exactly what fighters were involved in these operations has yet to be disclosed, but it stands to reason that air superiority-focused F-22 Raptors and electronic warfare aircraft like the Navy's EA-18G Growlers were all but certainly among them. And to that very point, a contingent of 12 US Air Force F-22s, widely considered to be the most capable air superiority fighters on the planet, relocated to Jordan in the Middle East from RAF Lakenheath just days before the offensive began, along with several more F-35As and both KC-135 and more modern KC-46 tankers. Likewise, the USS Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group positioned itself off the Iranian coast in the Arabian Sea, placing both longer-ranged F-35Cs and again, those electronic warfare-focused EA-18G Growlers within striking distance of the bombers' target areas. As the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, U.S. Air Force General Dan Kane, put it, the bombers, quote, linked up with escort and support aircraft in a complex, tightly timed maneuver requiring exact synchronization across multiple platforms and a narrow piece of airspace, all done with minimal communications. This type of integration is exactly what our joint force does better than anyone else in the world. And deep beneath the waves of the Arabian Sea, one of America's unique Ohio-class guided missile submarines was also sailing into position. Now, these subs began their service lives as ballistic missile submarines, tasked with carrying America's last resort arsenal of nuclear weapons. But back between 2002 and 2008, 4 of these boomers, as they're often called, were converted for non-nuclear duties and had vertical launch systems installed to instead employ a massive complement of 154 conventionally armed Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. As the bombers and fighters approached Iran's western border, the submarine launched at least 30 of these Tomahawks. Now, these weapons are powered by air-breathing turbofan engines, just like a tactical aircraft, allowing them to cover distances of greater than 1,000 miles while flying at relatively low altitudes, allowing them to mask their approach behind the curvature of the Earth and even the local terrain. With a cruising speed of around 570 miles per hour and hundreds of miles to cover to reach their targets in Isfahan, the timing of these launches had to be extremely precise to make sure that these missiles didn't reach their targets before the bombers reached theirs, and thus tipping Iranian defenses off about the operation. The Tomahawks were headed for key surface infrastructure targets at Isfahan, Iran's largest atomic science and uranium conversion facility, while the bombers closed with the hardened subterranean bunkers of Iran's uranium enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordow further north. Both of these facilities were built deep underground to prevent bunker-busting munitions from being able to reach them before being blanketed in the most robust air defenses Iran could muster. But after Israel's offensive into Iran last week utterly decimated the nation's entire air defense apparatus, it seems the American aircraft faced very little in the way of interference. Nonetheless, heavy jamming was reported throughout Iran as the strike package traversed its airspace, and just before arriving over the target location, American fighters launched what General Kane described as, quote, high-speed suppression weapons to mitigate any air defense systems that might come online during their approach. Now, these weapons were more likely than not radar-hunting AGM-88E advanced anti-radiation guided missiles, or AARGMs for short. These weapons carry an anti-radiation seeker that's capable of picking up and closing with the broadcasting electromagnetic radiation, or the radar waves used by air defense systems for targeting. But unlike older radar hunting missiles, these weapons also carry GPS-assisted inertial navigation and a millimeter wave radar seeker. So if the enemy powers down their radar array, the weapon can continue to close with its last known position. And as it approaches that position, if the enemy tries to pack up and relocate, the radar seeker makes it possible to even close with moving targets. Now, just before impact, these weapons transmit an image of their target back to the launching aircraft, making it possible to assess whether or not you have successfully mitigated the anti-air risk or not in real time. Now, with a maximum range of 60 miles, these weapons actually aren't even the latest and greatest radar hunting missiles that Uncle Sam has in his arsenal. With the newer AARGM ER, that ER denoting extended range, reaching initial operating capability with the Navy just a few months ago, and boasting the ability to strike targets roughly twice as far away at 120 miles or so. But it's currently unclear whether these weapons have completed integration testing with the Navy Super Hornets or its Growlers, and to be perfectly honest, they likely weren't even necessary for engaging Iran's degraded air defense network at this point. Now, regardless, these missiles were all but certainly launched without any specific targets in mind, and instead, the weapons were sent out to scan the area ahead of the strike package for enemy radar arrays that might be waiting to power up until the American aircraft were in range. Now, it's unclear whether these weapons did find targets to destroy or not, but American officials have stated that Iran didn't manage to launch a single missile at these bombers or their fighter escorts throughout the approach. Then, at roughly 2:10 a.m. local time, and after more than 18 hours in the air, the lead B-2 Spirit in the formation opened its massive payload bay doors and dropped both of those gigantic GBU-57s at very specific targets on the ground over Iran's subterranean Fordow facility. Now, dropped from high altitude, these 30,000-pound weapons ripped into the earth, penetrating what was probably more than 100 feet of rock and soil before detonating. Now, Fordow's massive 54,000-square-foot subterranean bunker is believed to house some 3,000 centrifuges used in the nuclear enrichment process, but at an estimated depth of somewhere between 260 and 300 feet below ground, it's pretty unlikely that even the massive GBU-57 could reach it, at least not on the first try. Immediately after the first bomber dropped its payload, a second bomber followed suit, dropping two more 30,000-pound bunker busters, and then another, striking 6 specifically chosen locations on the Earth above the Fordow complex with pinpoint accuracy. But that was just the beginning. Then 3 more B-2s dropped another 6 weapons directly into the holes produced by that first wave, penetrating all the way into the hardened facility before detonating a combined 27,540 pounds of a propellant-like plastic explosive that was developed specifically to maximize its blast energy output for bunker-busting applications. As these bombs tore through Iran's most protected nuclear site, the strike force headed south for Natanz as the Navy's Tomahawks closed in on Isfahan. The last 2 GBU-57s carried by the bombers were dropped on Natanz just minutes after the strikes on Fordow. And with a single large crater now visible in satellite imagery, it seems likely that these 2 bunker busters also penetrated through the same hole for maximum depth. Finally, with Fordow and Natanz struck, the Tomahawks made landfall in Isfahan, ending the strikes and leaving America's 7 bombers and their 14 crew members with nothing but a 17-plus-hour flight home left to overcome. Now, all of these strikes across Iran were carried out in less than 25 minutes. And in a subsequent press conference, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stressed that these strikes were, quote, not open-ended, as he put it, meaning the United States accomplished its goals of sufficiently degrading Iran's nuclear facilities and does not intend to continue combat operations against the embattled nation. That is, unless Iran retaliates toward American troops or other interests in the coming days. But to be clear, it still might be too early to say the job's entirely done. Since the strikes, Israeli officials have stated that Fordow was indeed extensively damaged, but likely wasn't entirely destroyed. Likewise, there remains concerns that Iran may have relocated its stockpile of enriched uranium, or even some of its centrifuges prior to the strikes, which could allow Iran to continue toward fielding nuclear weapons and hiding somewhere else in the country. But claims you may have seen flooding onto social media about the strikes being a failure are just as premature. In fact, I'd argue they're even less based in reality. It's clear, looking at the satellite images of the areas around Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, that these strikes were very effective at creating extensive damage throughout these facilities, and that damage is all but certainly enough to, quote, significantly degrade Iran's ability to continue building nuclear weapons. The question ultimately is, just how long will these strikes set the Iranian regime back? And that's the part that we'll need a much more robust battle damage assessment to work out. But to tell you the truth, whether or not these strikes mark the end of America's involvement in this fight, or just the beginning, is still very much up in the air. And at least for now, it's all about waiting to see what Iran does next. And with that ends this edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.